Hey, this is Rick Rogers. Welcome to my third installment in which I discuss my model for the 2020 presidential election. The big theme today is that Joe Biden still appears to be ahead, but that Donald Trump does have a pathway emerging in which he could win the Electoral College. We'll examine that later in this video. I'm not going to go over all the assumptions of my model, except to say that I am using poll of polls averages. There might need to be a couple things changed or made more transparent. The one thing that needs to be changed is my use of polling error. I am sticking with the 3% handicap to Trump, and that's also used when I split up the toss-up states. But after the last video in which I discussed polling error in 2016, maybe that should be 4%. This does affect one state, Arizona, in the model interpretation that I present today. Also, something that I've been doing consistently is that some polls give us two different scenarios. They give us a low turnout scenario and a high turnout scenario. And that has to go into the issue of the likely voter. The pollsters are trying to figure out whether or not you're going to vote before you actually get there. And some people say they're going to vote who don't. So they use historic patterns for your demographic group to determine whether or not you're actually going to show up at the polls. When there are multiple scenarios, I tend to take the narrowest gap because of the polling error in 2016. But that does have some implications for my results, and I will discuss that later. Here's my current scenario, and I have put up how it has changed over time. October 8th was my second installment, and there we were seeing a crest for Biden as a result of the first debate. Biden still is holding in the popular vote a similar lead. You'll notice that my projection for uncommitted voters at this point is decreasing, and that's important because that was a big source of last-minute votes for Trump in 2016. However, the estimates for other and uncommitted are very soft given the way the polling is reported. The big issue is the change in the Electoral College. You'll see it went up between September 24th and October 8th, but it has now gone down again. That's not as huge of a change as it looks, and I will go through that later on when I discuss what's happening in this scenario. Here is my current layout of states by the categories that I have been using. The movement to Colorado and Virginia is not a shift in the election. It's better polling, so I have more confidence that those two states go over in the far left under the Biden majority states. There is a lot of movement in the Great Lakes region with Minnesota, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. This seems to have been fairly constant throughout the election. So I am still keeping all of that region except for Ohio somewhere in the Biden category. In the Trump states, there has been an important shift, and that is slight leads in Ohio and Texas for Biden. The way this model works, if it's a slight lead, we assign it to Trump to account for the polling error. So they are well within the 3% range that I've been using. Iowa's out of that category. It's just outside of that category and has moved over into the Trump column, the clear Trump column. But we'll bring Iowa back later when we discuss the scenarios. And then there are the issues with Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina, and we will talk about that presently. When I began this exercise, as I mentioned in the first video, it was there are really two things to keep in mind. One, to understand election polling, we can't predict a clear winner because of the margins of error that are involved, but we can see patterns, trends, and we can build scenarios, which is what I'm doing here. And having gone through the three installments, we do have some things starting to emerge in the polling, that show us exactly where to look to determine what the outcome of this election might be. So when you are watching the returns as they come in over a few days this year, you will be able to concentrate on certain states that appear to be especially important to the outcome. I think what's been important in my scenarios is the rise of the flip-flop state. And I have those states there, Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina. Now, in this layout of my states, I have included how far behind Trump is. So the minus sign means that Biden's ahead and Trump is behind by that much. And I've also put three other states that are on the peripheries of this, Minnesota and Wisconsin that are in the Biden camp, and Iowa that are in the Trump camp. The clear part of this scenario is the emergence of these flip-flop states. And what I mean by that is that as I go from time period to time period with these installments, these are the states that are moving back and forth across the line between Biden and Trump. So the fact that Texas has moved from the Trump column to the Trump-leaning column is not a huge change in my projection, but Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina have moved back and forth. My scenario would have looked different, did look different yesterday than it looks today. And it looked very different a week ago. So we got to look at that. That is an indication that those states we don't have a good handle on it, and those are the ones that we should concentrate on, and those are the ones that we need to build our scenarios around. When I look at what's happening, it does appear that although Biden is leading, there is a pathway for Donald Trump. So to look at that pathway, let's start with the states that I am prepared to give to Trump. I am prepared to give Trump all of the states where Biden has a narrow lead. I should parenthetically put in here, the reason why Maine 2 has a question mark is the polling is not very good. Most recent poll had Biden ahead there, but the history of the polls has been inconsistent. And the history of that region has been to go for Trump. So I'm putting it in the Trump leaning column. But all these states in the Trump leaning column, they're narrow leads for Joe Biden. And I don't think the lead is big enough to overcome the issues we're going to see in polling error. And there are all kinds of complications that are emerging because of mail-in voting. And so I think the problems of potential disenfranchisement of people whose ballots are rejected because of problems with finding a witness or issues about the signature, even if those are valid ballots, that's part of the risk you take with a mail-in ballot. So I don't think that Biden's lead is enough to overcome those issues. The matter is a little bit different in the flip-flop states. I am prepared to concede that Florida and North Carolina could go Trump, just based on recent history and also the possibility of errors occurring there. So let's just assume that those are over in the Trump camp and then deal with what's left. And at this, that we have here, we're at the 290 electoral votes for Biden. So the question is, how do we go from Biden winning this to Trump winning this with a fairly small change in people's opinions on the matter? The two most important states in the switch to Trump are Arizona and Pennsylvania, where I think it is possible with very slight changes in public opinion about the two candidates. And I want to look at each of those. Pennsylvania, of course, is the big prize in this with 20 electoral votes. And the issue in Pennsylvania has been a sudden decline for Biden. Only a minor increase for Trump, but a big one for Biden. The question there is whether or not that is a real change. If we look at the 14-day window of polls that I use, this change really is triggered by two conservative-leaning polls appearing at about the same time, which suddenly, in terms of the averages that people use, gives the impression of a huge decline for Biden. Um, the most recent A-rated poll, and there's only been one in the 14-day window, which comes from Suffolk, suggests a 7% lead for Biden in Pennsylvania, in which case we have a very different interpretation of what's going on there. But the reason why we use poll of polls averages is we don't want to rely on any single poll, because any single poll could have a bad methodology, or just through the nature of sampling, that particular day they got a sample that is somehow more biased than it should be. So it's not really clear what's happening in Pennsylvania. It's still a Biden state. This could be a real shift. It would be surprising to see a shift that big in an election where it appears that most people have made up their minds. But we do have to factor in the fact that something does appear to be happening in Pennsylvania. And so we're going to see a huge fight over the next 2 weeks over people who are uncommitted, who or have soft support for their candidate. So the other state is Arizona, and here we have a very different story. We do not see a decline for Biden in Arizona. The issue there has been since September we've seen an increase for Trump. So those people who were not committed to a candidate in Arizona seem to be moving towards Trump, and that's resulted in a closing of what had been a moderately good gap for Biden just a few weeks ago. So Arizona does appear to, on some level, be closing. However, Biden is holding his vote. So that may be enough. We don't know, but that's certainly something that we should look at. The two states together, Pennsylvania and Arizona, are needed for Trump to win. So Pennsylvania, with its 20 electoral votes, are not enough. If Pennsylvania does go for Trump, Trump also needs another state. And so what I'm saying is the most likely state is Arizona. There could be another pathway here, and let's call this the Wisconsin scenario. It seems odd that if I would say, so let's say Arizona does not go, is there another way Trump could do this? I'm leapfrogging past Nevada and Michigan, which, just given the dynamics qualitatively, do not look like they're going to go for Trump. I'm jumping over to Wisconsin because Wisconsin is a state that had a polling error of over 7% in the 2016 election. So that's a state, when we see that minus 7.2 for Trump, that there is a possibility as we work through this that could be a place where things work out. If Trump gets Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, Trump wins. If Biden wins Pennsylvania, but Trump gets Arizona and Wisconsin, we end up with a tie in the Electoral College. Let's have some straight talk about the polling so we can understand what's going on better and why there are points of ambiguity. I do think that the 2020 polling will be much better than 2016, at least in the area of balancing the issue of education. So in 2016, the pollsters did have a bias that they weren't considering in their polls, and that bias meant that more college-educated voters were included, and that was the segment that tended to vote for Hillary Clinton. So they have some corrections in there. It's not clear how good those corrections will be. I have a concern in the polls over certain populations where there are trends that appear to be independent of sociodemographic characteristics. For example, with evangelical voters, where there appear to be questions of religious identity that are informing their vote. So also turnout, which I'll talk about in a bit, affects the polling. But I do think they're going to be better on the education question. And those problems, by the way, in 2016, when you look at the numbers that the pollsters have reported themselves about what they did, those were some pretty big errors. So I do think at least that part is going to be fixed, but there are still some other uncertainties, as there are every year. I think there is too much discussion of the increased registration among Republicans and evangelicals for this election, and the reason is that the Democrats had huge gains in registrations at the midterms, so it's not clear that we're talking about an advantage going to Donald Trump because of this, as much as it is a rebalancing. So it's hard for me to read those stories without thinking about 2018. So I'm not sure that the increased registration is going to have as much effect as people think. I could be wrong, but that's my current view on that. High turnout does seem to favor the Democrats, but we have to consider some things in this. The large early voting numbers are not a sign of high turnout overall. They just mean a certain segment of voters is energized to vote early. Mail-in voting is creating some uncertainty. The Democrats are counting on it to increase turnout. However, there are issues with who's witnessing the signature in those states that require it, the signature itself, and late arrival issues that are an artifact of voting by this method. They are problems that don't happen when you actually show up at a poll and vote in person. So the Democrats are counting on the increase the increased turnout that mail-in voting creates to offset any of the problems of mail-in voting. I'm not convinced yet that they're right. This could be an unusual situation because of people having very strong feelings about this election. But in a normal election, I would say that the change might actually be a wash. There is an issue emerging with voters under 35. First off, that those voters were not recruited as well as by the Democrats as they were in the past, largely because the Democrats relied on recruiting on college campuses. The pandemic really broke that part of the Democratic machine. But also in some of the early voting numbers, it looks like that voters under 35 are less likely to use early voting. This is a red flag and could affect Biden's chances. If we look at the Democratic primaries, look at the large crowds that Bernie Sanders and Liz Warren would draw, and those were often from this younger voting group. But in most states, that group did not show up on election day. It confused support for a candidate, liking a candidate, with actually voting for that candidate. And right now, that behavior is what seems to be continuing in the election. Again, there's still ample time to change that. It could change quickly. So we'll have to see what happens over the weeks to come. The other thing, though, about turnout, and this is where I stress from early in the presentation, I talked about the fact that I use the narrow gap, is that I could be underestimating support for Biden. So let me show you here as an example the Monmouth University poll for Arizona. Monmouth is an A-rated pollster. I circled the part that I want to look at. The low likely turnout scenario that they have shows a gap of 2 percentage points favoring Biden, and that's the gap that I'm using in my model. However, go to the left and look at their high likely turnout scenario, which shows a 7% gap for Biden. What Monmouth is saying is what I talked about earlier. It does look like that high turnout favors the Democratic Party, and so if we really do have a high turnout election, things are going to work out for Biden better than I am projecting in my scenarios. Here's how I see what's happening today. And I'll begin this by saying what's happening in the polls. It's not clear to me that people change their minds about candidates as much as the polls change. The polls pick things up. Now, there are uncommitted candidates and people who move back and forth, but in this election, all the signs are that that most people have made up their mind. Joe Biden today has a decisive lead in the national popular vote, probably 7 to 9%. There is one poll sponsored by Investors Business Daily that suggests that there has been a decline, substantial decline in support for Joe Biden since October 12th. That appears to be an outlier. We're not seeing that kind of substantial change in other polls. We are seeing some fluctuation in polls where it goes down one day and goes another way the next. So it appears to be a fairly stable lead in the popular vote that Biden has. Biden is maintaining a slim lead in the Electoral College. Compared to where we were back in the beginning of September, when I was saying the only state that seems to matter is Pennsylvania, that map has expanded, and other states seem to matter, and Trump now needs other states that he did not need in September. Not just needing more states, but when he looks at the states that we thought would be Trump states, safe states, like Georgia, Ohio, and Texas, they have been moving Biden. The question is, have they moved far enough that Biden will win those, even though Biden does appear to have a lead today in the polls? But if you're planning the strategy for Trump, you now know you have to go into those states and defend them. So by spreading the map, it also spreads out Donald Trump's time and money. There are 3 flip-flop states, Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina, that seem to be moving back and forth in my model about how they're classified. And certainly they deserve a lot of attention because they could be very decisive in the outcome. There's still a pathway for Trump so that he could win the Electoral College in spite of losing the popular vote by 7%. And that pathway most likely would go through Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Wisconsin. So in total, we have 5 states that we're looking at. Florida and North Carolina that I think are going to go for Trump based on their history and polling errors. Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Wisconsin that I regard as still up in the air. So we got to pay attention to those 5 states. And I mentioned Florida and North Carolina because Biden is leading there. But it looks like they could still go Trump. He's not leading enough. I have not commented on the Hunter Biden story. I may do a separate video on that because I do study conspiracy theories. It doesn't matter whether or not that is or is not a conspiracy theory or part of it's true and the part about Joe Biden is not true. The important thing is what's the impact on people's perception of the candidates and their voting preferences. So far, this does not appear to have a major effect. Now, that could change if that story sticks, but right now it appears that voters are disregarding it. That's my presentation for the day. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the rest of today and the week. Bye.